So yes, thanks very much for having me. And as Alice just mentioned, this work is related to work that I have recently completed as part of a Wellcome Investigator Award, which was looking at the place of the public in public health in Britain since the establishment of the NHS in 1948. And my own part of that project was looking at health education and how health educators conceptualize the public, but also how the public were able to speak back to health education in some ways through health education materials. And having previously worked on the history of heroin addiction, I sort of homed in on the history of intoxicants as one of the ways in which to think about how health education messages were presented. So I've made use of lots of visual material in the project and in this presentation, some of which comes from the Wellcome collection and some of it from other places like the National Library of Medicine in the States and the Science Museum. So in this paper, I want to focus on the use of humour in public health education campaigns against various intoxicants in Britain from the late 1970s through to the early 1990s. I want to address the question of how and why humour was used and to what effect or effects. I'm going to begin by briefly exploring the context of this, and especially the growth of mass media health education from the 1960s onwards. I then want to move on to discuss 3 different intoxicants: tobacco, alcohol, and heroin. And I'm going to assess the extent to which humour was used and how this differed across the 3 substances, and then start to think about some of the implications that this might, impact that this might have had. I then want to conclude by reflecting on what this might tell us about attitudes towards various intoxicants and their users, and how this might change over time and between groups. So, of course, attempts to educate the public about threats to their health weren't anything new in the post-war period. There'd been a lively culture of health education in the interwar period in Britain, other parts of Europe, and in North America. But after World War II, health education started to take on an added degree of significance. And this was because of the epidemiological transition. So essentially the decline of mortality and morbidity in relation to infectious disease and the rise of chronic or non-communicable disease, which took place from the early 20th century onwards. By the 1950s and 1960s, epidemiological research was beginning to show that many chronic conditions such as heart disease and some forms of cancer were caused, at least in part, by individual lifestyles. So there was a connection made between smoking and lung cancer, between diet and heart disease, all of which seemed to make it clear that individual behaviour had a role to play in disease etiology. The putative solution to this was to encourage individuals to change their behaviour, and health education was seen as one of the ways in which this could be achieved, especially through the mass media. There was a great deal of enthusiasm at the time about the possibilities of mass market advertising in the print media and also on TV. So a government committee on health education, the Cohen Committee, recommended the wider use of mass media campaigns and also called for the establishment of a central body to oversee health education. And the government largely took up those recommendations, and in 1968, the Health Education Council was established. Under the aegis of the HEC, from the late 1960s onwards, numerous health education campaigns on a range of topics such as diet, exercise, and the use of intoxicants were launched. So I want now to have a look at some of the tactics that were mobilised, including humour, but as we'll see, there were other things used as well. So beginning with tobacco then, we're going to see that humour was occasionally used in relation to anti-tobacco campaign materials, but other tropes I think were more often utilised. So in this poster, which is a fairly early anti-tobacco campaign from probably sometime in the early 1960s, we can see that concern about the potential impact of smoking on others, especially children, and this was well before the link between passive smoking and health was established. But this sort of essentially the kind of feelings of parental love, parental guilt are being mobilised in an attempt to try and persuade people to stop smoking, to rethink their smoking and certainly around their children. Another theme was the financial cost of smoking and what a smoker could save by giving up the habit. In these posters, a range of consumer goods like clothing and a transistor radio are dangled in front of the viewer as objects that they could afford if only they'd stop smoking. And I think there's also a sort of certain kind of wry humour at work here, especially in the image of the young woman who appears to be in danger of losing her boyfriend to another woman because she's more desirable, because she can afford various consumer goods because she doesn't smoke. And such images, I think, reflect the burgeoning consumer culture at the time, the appearance of the teenager, and a relative degree of affluence. Alongside appeals to consumerist desires, another common tactic was an attempt to shock smokers into giving up by portraying the consequences of smoking in horrifying or disgusting detail. So this image illustrates the damage that smoking causes to lungs and dramatically elevated risk of lung cancer in smokers, but also plays on much longer running tropes around cleanliness and hygiene and health. Disgust could also be combined with humour, as we can see in this campaign featuring glam rock idol Mark Bolan. The poster is clearly intended to appeal to young women, with its attempt to motivate concerns about sexual attractiveness, combined with feelings of disgust and a mildly humorous edge. Once again, the financial costs of smoking and the goods, including clothes and makeup, that could be bought instead of cigarettes are emphasised. A dark kind of gallows humour could also be found in some of the images intended to shock, such as this one. So this is revolving around a visual image, a very dark visual joke, with a coffin doubling as the flip-top box for the smoker. So with tobacco, I think humour was often combined with other tropes to try and appeal to audiences on a range of different levels. And I don't have time to go into detail on more materials on tobacco, as I want to look at some other intoxicants. But as the evidence of the danger of smoking increased into the 1980s and 1990s, even this kind of dark humour tends to disappear from anti-smoking campaigns. And that might suggest that the perceived relative damage caused by an intoxicant was related to the use of humour in public health campaigns, with the most risky intoxicants were rarely dealt with in a humorous way, as we will see. Where we do see more use of humour, though, I think is in some of the public health campaigns around alcohol. A variety of tactics, including humour, were used in attempts to encourage the public to limit their consumption of alcohol. The Everybody Likes a Drink, Nobody Likes a Drunk campaign, which ran in the northeast of England in the late 1970s, used lots of different types of images and tropes. So there are elements of guilt and disgust in some of the other material that was in this campaign. But in this particular image, they're attempting to marshal humour. So there's another visual gag at work here, playing on the universal symbol for male to imply that drinking too much could negatively impact sexual performance. Such tactics, of course, are quite clever, and the campaign was actually went on and won an advertising industry prize. But I think there was a danger that it could perhaps be a little bit too clever for its own good. In a survey of people who'd seen the campaign, some confessed to not understanding this image as they didn't recognise the symbol. One wit even suggested that the symbol represented a crashed Volvo car, because of course there's a visual similarity to the badge that appears on Volvo cars. So what this tells us, of course, is that images, as we know, are open to lots of different interpretations. And that's something I want to come back to in a minute when I talk about some of the anti-heroin material. So despite the potential for humorous campaign materials to backfire, humour was seen as being an especially valuable tool in health education efforts around alcohol. And we can see that in the Drinkwise campaign, which was first launched in 1990. The campaign was a result of a collaboration between the Health Education Authority, which replaced the Health Education Council, and the charity Alcohol Concern. Its aim was to get people to think about the amount that they were drinking and then become more aware of the suggested upper consumption limits. The campaign materials were anchored around various cartoon drawings of an elephant and the tagline, "Never forget that there's a limit." The image of the elephant, the campaign's designers asserted, contains the warmth and humour essential to conveying the acceptance of drink in society. Now, I'm not entirely clear why they chose an elephant to do this. Presumably an elephant was picked because elephants supposedly have good memories, and that underscored the message about not forgetting that there's a limit to alcohol consumption. And of course, elephants supposedly get drunk in the wild by eating rotten fruit. But in any case, the images portray the elephant in various mildly humorous and/or embarrassing situations. So here the elephant is embarrassed to have been caught out recycling a large amount of anti-alcohol bottles. The text accompanying the image reiterates this, stating that most of us have a skeleton in the drinks cupboard, some little embarrassing moment brought about by having too much to drink. So what seems to be intended here is to both bring to mind some embarrassing, perhaps also slightly amusing, but nonetheless regretful incident that the viewer had encountered in their own life, and then use this as a spur to get people to reflect on more sensible drinking patterns. The social element of embarrassment is also emphasised in this image. Here, the elephant is obviously in danger of embarrassing themselves at a party and missing out on the chatting and dancing because they're in a drunken stupor. Again, this image is supposed to resonate with the viewer and provoke reflection on the amount of alcohol one should consume. Alcohol consumption isn't being prohibited. We're told that most of us enjoy a drink, but this should be within the sensible drinking limits. This, it is suggested, will mean that we really then enjoy the party. In this poster, the elephant, though, has clearly failed to take the advice offered in the previous poster and is feeling the after effects of the night before with a nasty hangover. Once again, the viewer is reminded of what the sensible limits of alcohol consumption are. Now, many of the images in the campaign are about overconsumption and its effects, something which tied in with the intention of communicating sensible drinking limits. But beneath this softly approach, I think there were other tropes and trends at work as well. Some of the material explicitly targeted drinking in the home, something which had increased from the 1980s onwards. This was reflective of a broader shift in anti-alcohol campaigning that had moved to target all drinkers and all spaces where alcohol was consumed, not just those drinking in public or those deemed to be drinking in a particularly problematic way. Nonetheless, the generally light-hearted tone of the material was not just a tactic, but a broader reflection of attitudes towards alcohol and drinkers. The use of humour was a recognition of the social and cultural importance of alcohol consumption within British society, as well as its economic value, and the need to tread carefully to avoid turning people off altogether. But such an approach could pose difficulties as it contributed to a sense that the overconsumption of alcohol wasn't to be taken entirely seriously, or at least not as seriously as other health issues. In contrast, the material on illegal drugs, and especially heroin, went very much the other way, making use of shock horror tactics to deliver a much more prohibitionist message. The Heroin Screws You Up campaign, which ran in England between 1985 and 1986, is typical. The campaign consisted of posters, print media adverts, and 2 short films. The magazine and newspaper adverts were mostly black and white. Presumably this was partly because they were cheaper to reproduce, but also the dark tone helped underscore the darkness of the message and the dangerousness of heroin. Advertisements featured a mixture of male and female protagonists. All were young and all were white. Each advertisement had a similar look, but a slightly different emphasis. So in this one, it appears to be very much focusing on the physical and mental consequences of heroin use. So there's a picture of a young man surrounded by details of the physical effects of injecting drug use and addiction to heroin. The text underneath elaborates on this and emphasises how the side effects begin before addiction sets in. So we're seeing a narrative of progressive decline from use to sickness and addiction, and all of that's reinforced by this image of a dirty, pale, sweaty, spotty young man. Some of the themes of loss of control and progressive decline are at work in this advertisement, and it emphasises the apparent inevitability of addiction, even for those who think that they can handle it to begin with. The physical consequences of addiction are emphasised, as well as the potential economic and social damage that addiction might do to you in your life. And this image is very clearly resonant of the kind of progressive decline images that James was just talking about with Cruikshank and Cynthia was talking about yesterday. You can kind of see that the echoes of temperance material there in the way in which it's describing this progressive decline. The cost of heroin use, both financial and social, as well as the physical, were also emphasised in this image. Like the earlier smoking material, these images are located within a consumer culture that used young people's expectations and desires around consumer goods as a way to persuade them to not use drugs. The campaign's dark tone and blatant use of scare tactics had a questionable impact, though. Although studies reported that young people had a high recall of the campaign, some also came away with the erroneous information, such as the idea that using heroin led inevitably to death. Indeed, many experts were appalled by the campaign, pointing out that the scare tactics were unlikely to change the behaviour of those already using drugs and would instead lead to an increase in the stigmatisation of drug users. Some young people who viewed the campaign certainly failed to take it seriously. There were numerous reports of young people taking the posters and putting them up on their bedroom walls in a kind of ironic commentary on the campaign's anti-drug message. So such imagery was clearly open to appropriation and even inversion, and humour was a big part of this. And of course, that's nothing new, as Cynthia was discussing yesterday. Images are often appropriated and reappropriated by people and over time. And such appropriation, I think, is interestingly continued in relation to Heroin Screws You Up, So after seeing this image of former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn in the GQ magazine, one viewer noted visual similarities between it and the Heroin Screws You Up campaign. So he kind of reappropriated the poster and put it up on Twitter. So there's all kinds of humorous inversions of these messages coming from below. But alternative or somewhat subversive humour could also be put to use in public health messaging around illegal drugs, although this rarely came from the government itself. So as Peter was talking about yesterday, humour was used by some agencies in attempting to deliver a harm reduction message. And again, I'm talking about the example that Peter mentioned yesterday, which is the comic Smack in the Eye, which was produced by the Manchester-based charity Lifeline and illustrated by Michael Linnell. The comic first appeared in 1987 with the explicit aim to produce a comic for drug users to communicate harm reduction messages in a humorous manner. As Peter mentioned yesterday, Smack in the Eye was sexually explicit, expletive-laden, and contained graphic images of drug use. It initially reached some sort of criticism, but they managed to keep the comic going for over 9 years. And it used humour to deliver messages around harm reduction, the safer use of illegal drugs, and HIV/AIDS prevention. And I just want to focus in on one example, one storyline, and one that Peter also briefly mentioned yesterday, and that was comic book regular Tough Shit Thomas. So Tough Shit Thomas is a self-declared junkie cat who's only got one leg and invariably uses up one of his 9 lives in doing something stupid in relation to his heroin use. In this story, he's tasked by his girlfriend to take their used syringes to the needle exchange. On the way to the exchange, Thomas considers dumping the needles in a nearby bin. He then starts to speculate on what could happen if he did. This sparks off a catastrophic chain of events involving kittens, a bin man, a politician, a freak accident, and the leader of a fictional nuclear power. A message gets mistranslated, resulting in nuclear war, leading to the destruction of the planet, all because Thomas couldn't be bothered to go to the needle exchange. So Thomas breaks out of his reverie, he resolves to do the right thing and goes to the needle exchange, where he's talked through the confidential, easy process of exchanging his used needles for new ones. On the way home, he spots a, quote, local nutter dumping his works in the bin, and when Thomas confronts him, he has the bin smashed over his head for his troubles. Now, clearly, there's lots that could be said about this image and its kind of its heritage and its origins, from references to Tom and Jerry cartoons all the way back to Dalton and the Great Cat Massacre that Peter mentioned yesterday, but also sort of all apocalyptic fears about the end of the Cold War. But for our purposes, I think what's interesting is that this humour is being used to actually deliver what is a fairly banal message, but nonetheless an important one in relation to harm reduction. And that's that you should dispose of your used needles responsibly, that it's safe and easy, and that only nutters don't do so. Now, this particular story was deemed especially useful, and it was actually later produced as a separate leaflet for users on how to access needle exchange. Like other Lifeline publications, humour was used as a way to reach drug users in an apparently non-judgmental way, although I think there's actually quite a lot of judgment going on here about others and about how one should act responsibly. There are also interesting echoes, I think, of the Drinkwise campaign. Once again, we've got an anthropomorphized animal using humour to deliver a message about acting responsibly. But the fact that with Drinkwise, the message is coming from official sources, and with Smack in the Eye, it's coming from a harm reduction orientated voluntary organisation, tells us something about the relative position of these intoxicants and their users in society. So that then brings me to some of the thoughts about questions that I opened with. How and why was humour used, and to what effect? And more broadly, what does this tell us about attitudes towards intoxicants and their users? Humour was deployed by health educators as a way to engage viewers in anti-intoxicant messages. Humour was sometimes used alone, but sometimes combined with other tactics such as disgust and shock. Humour was used in the case of alcohol, as we saw with the Drinkwise campaign, to deliver a somewhat softer message, one that encouraged drinkers to think about their alcohol consumption levels, but one that also recognised the place of alcohol within society. For drugs, humour was not really used in the official messages, but it was used in the harm reduction literature like Smack in the Eye, directed towards those already using drugs. It was seen as a way to encourage people who would be put off by strong anti-drug messages. But behind all of these messages, there was an intention to encourage behaviour change. For smoking and illegal drugs, this was mostly directed towards stopping use, or better yet, never having started to begin with. For alcohol, a more nuanced kind of behaviour change was being encouraged, directed towards sensible drinking and rational consumption of alcohol. And this, of course, speaks to the different attitudes towards different intoxicants, with alcohol being widely used and socially acceptable, smoking permitted but becoming less acceptable over this period, and heroin prohibited and unacceptable, at least in most circles. The use of humour in anti-intoxicant campaigns, though, wasn't without risk. Humorous messages often require people to get the joke, which they may not, as this requires a shared understanding of language, signs, symbols, tropes, and so on that simply may not exist. What people find funny is often peculiar, and unfunny message may well have lost much of its emotional appeal and resonance. Like intoxicants, the effects of humour on individuals varies. As with any set of images, campaigns will also open to multiple interpretations and readings, some of which went against the grain of the central message. Ironic reappropriations of the Heroin Screws You Up campaign tell us not only that the campaign missed its target with some groups and individuals, but also that there were alternative readings and interpretations of drug use and drug users. Humour then serves as a way not only to think about the different tactics used by health educators, but also the ways in which these messages were received, understood, and acted upon, or not. Humour reminds us that there are multiple ways of reading responses to intoxicant use, even within health education campaigns that on the surface deliver clear anti-substance use messages. All of this reminds us, as indeed the papers in this workshop have demonstrated, that we need to take humour seriously. Thank you.